No president in history has been more friendly to drug dealers than Donald Trump. Only Donald Trump has pardoned high-level drug dealers, including the biggest drug trafficker ever convicted in the United States, the former president of Honduras. But at the same time, Donald Trump wants to kill the lowest-ranking people in drug trafficking anywhere in the world, men on small boats who might or might not be trafficking drugs from South America, thousands of miles from the United States. Donald Trump will kill them without a trial, and he will release giant drug dealers after they've been convicted in unanimous verdicts returned by American juries right here in the United States. The president of Honduras was convicted of drug charges in the United States and sentenced to 45 years in prison. That's how seriously the judge and the jury considered the charges against the former president of Honduras. And Donald Trump, not knowing one word about the evidence in that case, issued a full pardon to the former president of Honduras, the biggest drug dealer ever convicted in the United States. According to Washington Post analysis, Donald Trump has pardoned or granted clemency to at least 10 people for drug-related crimes since the beginning of his second term, and granted pardons or commutations to almost 90 others for drug-related crimes during the 4 years of his first term, the analysis showed. And Donald Trump's own Attorney General, Pam Bondi, told the Supreme Court last year that military service members are required not to follow illegal orders. The New York Times reports that in a friend of the court brief last year, Pam Bondi, then working as an attorney for a conservative think tank, wrote, military officers are trained not to carry out unlawful orders, and they know they may be held criminally liable if they did carry out such orders. The military would not carry out a patently unlawful order from the president to kill non-military targets. Indeed, service members are required not to do so. And today, Donald Trump's former defense attorney, Alina Habba, resigned as United States Attorney for New Jersey a week after the Third Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals upheld a ruling disqualifying her from holding that office. She's the second Trump-appointed U.S. attorney to be disqualified after Lindsey Halligan was removed from her position in the Eastern District of Virginia. And joining us now is Democratic Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island. He's a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And Senator, we have Donald Trump, who wants to kill anyone moving in a small boat that might or might not have drugs in it thousands of miles away. But if you're the president of Honduras and you're sentenced to 45 years by a judge after conviction by a jury in this country, Donald Trump is the president and the only one in history who will let you go completely free for that.
Yep, 400 tons worth minimum of cocaine that this narco state leader was convicted of bringing into the United States as basically the guy who used his position as president to give cover to the drug dealers. And he got a pardon. And I just, I don't think we know the whole story yet. You get people like Roger Stone and Matt Gaetz involved in asking for pardons, and somewhere some money changed hands. So we'll find out, I guess, sooner or later, but it sure doesn't look good. The other thing that's interesting about this is that creepy guy in the Justice Department who told everybody that they needed to be ready to tell judges, F off, we're not going to follow your orders, and who Trump and his little team stuffed onto the Third Circuit Court of Appeals during the window while the contempt hearing against that guy was stayed by 2 Trump judges. That guy was on the prosecution of President Hernandez. So he can't really say that this was a bad Biden prosecution, that the fix was in some bad way against Hernandez. The guy that is his sort of chief thug in the early days of the MAGA DOJ, and who he loved so much, he put him on the Circuit Court of Appeals. Of course, not one Democrat would vote for this guy, but they shoved him through. That guy was on the case. So there's really no logic to it on the merits, which takes you back to You know, where did the money change hands? What was the deal behind the scenes that we're seeing thanks to, you know, presidential immunity, and he gets to commit crimes for free?
Yeah, Emil Bove has the distinction of being one of Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyers after being one of the prosecutors who got that conviction against the former president of Honduras. And here's Pam Bondi last year as a private citizen telling the Supreme Court that a president who gives an order to kill unarmed people somewhere, non-combatants outside of war, that's clearly illegal, and no one in the military would follow an order like that ever.
Yeah, no cry of sedition against her for saying the exact same thing that Mark Kelly and others did. And it calls to mind the fact that they've just dug out that 2 of Trump's mortgages had the exact same statement that he planned to live in them as his principal residence, and he never did. And there were 2, so they can't both be a principal residence. So, you know, here are 2 examples of, well, if it's a Democrat doing it, then it's a really big deal. We're going to accuse them of sedition. We're going to talk about hanging them. We're going to put up fake prosecutions against them. But when it's me or my MAGA Attorney General Pam Bondi, then you just whistle past it as if it weren't real. It's just bonkers. The thing that they forget is the judges read the newspapers. And the more this president and this attorney general and this Department of Justice look like the Gangster Gong show, the less cred they will have with courts. And that is not a good place for the Department of Justice to be.
Senator, as you know, Kash Patel has a new entry in the Gangster Gong show. I'd like to get to that with you right after the commercial break that we want to squeeze in right here. We'll be right back with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse.